Okay, this is part two of our video on environmentalism and private property or property regimes in general. So in this video, we're primarily going to talk about how exactly we can go about justifying property regimes. So given the fact that use of land and its resources not only takes away from the resources that are available to others, but we also, through the problem of externalities, put things into the land, pollution, and things like that. David Schmitz and Carol Rose talk about ways that different kinds of property regimes do better or worse with respect to these kinds of problems. Okay, so first of all, one thing that we do to take note of is that there is a difference between justifying a property regime and justifying individual acts of appropriation. All right, so a property regime is something that is, again, formalized or institutionalized. It's something that we actually give consideration to. It's something that we as individuals in a society put in place through certain kinds of negotiations and coming to some kind of agreements that we make with each other. So in order to have a property regime, you need to have a pretty well-established society in the first place. So this is where talking about private property and regimes of private property can get a little bit messy. So given the fact that a lot of our respect for each other's space is going to be based on custom, based on how close-knit we are as a community, when we come to the point where we're actually trying to formalize or institutionalize a property regime, it may just be common sense. So if I have already built a fence around what has been sort of commonly accepted as my land, it doesn't seem that much work legally or politically needs to be done in order to get other people to sort of respect those kinds of boundaries. So why? Because when it comes to these kinds of customary practices, the more close-knit we are as a community, when we sort of violate those unspoken rules about use of resources and things like that, if we're a really close-knit community, then violating those customs can sort of make us be excluded, right? So if as a community as a whole, without all the institutionalized or formalized property regimes, we just kind of have these unspoken or unwritten laws or boundaries. If I am the individual who says, well, hey, who's here to stop me? If I violate those kinds of unspoken rules or boundaries, I can find myself being excluded from other kinds of activities. I might find myself on the margins of our community and things like that. Whereas, man, those kinds of customs, when they're within a really close-knit community, they not only give us room to talk about who is a part of the community and who isn't a part of the community, even communal institutions have the right to exclude. If you're not exactly towing the communal line, you can be made to feel really, really, really uncomfortable and unwelcome here. Okay. Now, so in order to have like a property regime, we need to already have a pretty well-established society. Now, and secondly, even if a property regime or a theory of appropriation is justified, it doesn't follow that every individual act of appropriation is justified. So even if we have a institutionalized or formalized property regime, whether it's private property or communal property, or we have commons, or we have regulated public areas, that we all pay for and then we all are free, have the liberty to enjoy. Just because we've justified or institutionalized a certain regime or theory about how this is going to work, it doesn't mean that every individual act of appropriation is going to be justified. So David Schmitz talks about the game, so if the regime itself is the game, it doesn't follow that every individual move made or every individual play made within the game is going to be justified as well. Now, but which moves are and are not allowed as a part of the game, or in this case, which kinds of individual acts of appropriation are and are not allowed, those are should probably already be set in stone by the time we're actually putting a property regime into place. Okay, now Schmitz also goes on to say this. He says that appropriation is permitted when resources are plentiful. So that certainly is true. So even in times where resources are plentiful and there's enough for everybody, we're still justified in individuating various parcels of land. Now, but he makes the further claim that it's required when resources are scarce. So when resources are plentiful, appropriation of private property is justified. However, when resources are scarce, appropriation is absolutely necessary. Now, why is that? Part of the problem here is, again, this goes back to the tragedy of the commons, is what happens when we have scarce resources. When we have scarce resources, we have a limited supply that everybody needs to use, but we don't have set parameters in place with respect to their upkeep or making sure that the resources are not exhausted. Now, what private property does is it makes it very clear and unambiguous concerning who stands to benefit from the use of the land or the use of the resources, but it also makes it clear and unambiguous who is primarily responsible for its upkeep. So if I own a plot of land that I intend on farming, clearly I stand to benefit from developing the land in whatever way that I see fit. Now, but clearly, since I understand I'm the only one that stands to benefit, I would also understand that I am the only one primarily responsible for its upkeep. If I want to benefit from developing the land, I need to take care of the land. Now, part of the problem with commons is we all want to benefit from its use, but it's not clear who exactly is primarily responsible for its upkeep. And as we talked about in class, this is where things like the free rider problem will come up and things. So it's a common area. Well, who gets to enjoy it? Well, we all get to enjoy it. We all get to use the land. Well, who's primarily responsible for its upkeep? We all are. Well, saying that we are all responsible, that is just too vague. It's too vague to talk about, okay, so if I take 2 apples and you take 3 and that person over there takes 4, it's true that if they wouldn't have taken 4, the land wouldn't have been, or the apples wouldn't have been depleted. But it's also true that if I wouldn't have taken 2, like if I would have only taken 1 apple, it wouldn't have mattered that the other person took 4. But if that, and if you would have only taken 2 instead of 3, it wouldn't have mattered that that person took 4. So that's where determining who is responsible when it comes to common ownership or communal ownership, that's where all of this gets rather bungled. Now, and environmentally, it certainly is the case that since I'm, on my own land, if I want to develop it and enjoy its resources, I'm also responsible for taking care of whatever problems arise on my land, whether that be waste resource management, pollution, and things like this. Now, so this is where David Schmitz talks about the difference between small, medium, and large events, and then the externality. And the externalities that come along with those events. Okay, now, so take this for example. So suppose we're neighbors and we've got nice, evenly divided parcels of land that are fenced in. So let's just say as far as land distribution is concerned, there's just a charter that we're all just given individual 3-acre parcels of land. Now, since we're given individual 3-acre parcels of land, we have very defined boundaries about which resources are mine and which resources are yours. So it's my responsibility to know how much grazing or how much cultivation my land can take without, depriving my own land of all of its resources. If I want to benefit in the future from using the resources and using the land, I need to be reasonable enough and practical enough to make sure that I don't completely exhaust those resources. So we've got a fence. So my resources are there, your resources are there. Now, if there's a hole in my fence, and let's say my sheep wander off of my property and then start grazing on your property, it is abundantly clear who is responsible for the depleted resources on your land. It is my responsibility. So it is because I did not properly repair my fences or even put up my fences in the first place that now you are being made worse off. So it is my fault if my sheep get off of my property and then wander onto your property and start grazing on your land. If in the process of this happening, you are somehow made worse off, your land is now depleted. My sheep produce a lot of waste on your land, which needs to be cleaned up, and all of that. It is abundantly clear that I am responsible. It is my responsibility to make you whole because it is my fault that you are made worse off in that kind of way. So that's very easy to determine. That is what we would call a small event or a medium event. Now, what's more difficult environmentally is when we talk about large events. So if my sheep get off of my property and wander onto your property, it's only your parcel of land which is really being affected here. Now, but suppose there's a river which cuts through all of these individual parcels of land, and I'm just letting my sheep poop wherever they want, and I'm not cleaning it up. And my sheep's animal waste, the animal waste actually gets into the river, and because of that river flowing, that's going to affect everybody that river whose land intersects. So it's going to make you worse off, it's going to make the parcel next to you worse off, and so on and so on and so on. Now, so if this area of land is heavily occupied, that is going to be a larger scale event. Now, but if it's my plot of land and then several miles downriver there's another plot of land, the fact that I'm not exactly cleaning up my animal waste on my own property, that's not going to be that significant of a deal. Why? Because we're not closely packed in together. So the more concentrated the human population is, and the closer together various plots of land are together, and the various ways private parcels of land with their various resources are conglomerated together, something that is a small scale event when there's less people occupying a certain region and using those resources is going to be a much larger scale event, right? So something that's a small scale event when there's not a lot of people in close proximity to each other is going to be a much larger scale event when there are a lot of individuals in close proximity to each other. Okay, now the other problem with large scale events with respect to responsibility is, what do we do with things like carbon emissions and climate change and things like that? So who's responsible for climate change? Well, we all are. Well, who's responsible for doing something about it? We all are. But to what extent are we responsible, right? So if I own a plot of land and I build a factory on that land and I'm releasing all these carbon emissions into the atmosphere, this kind of event does not only affect my neighbors, although it might immediately affect my neighbors through things like smog and things like that. But I mean, if I'm contributing to greenhouse gases, through carbon emissions and things like this, this is a large scale event. Once the carbon gets into the atmosphere, we can't go into the atmosphere and determine whose carbon is this carbon and whose carbon is this carbon and whose carbon is this carbon. Now, we can talk about how individual nation states have contributed more over the years as far as carbon emissions and things like that. But clearly, I, as a United States citizen, living in 2020, I had nothing to do with the fact that for the last, 150 years or so, the United States was one of the greater contributors to carbon emissions and things like that through industry than other countries were. So I, as a American citizen in 2020, I had nothing to do with what people 100 years ago, before I was even born, decided to do. I mean, same with England. I mean, there was a time in London, for example, where there was so much coal dust in the air that you had to clean the windows almost on a daily basis. Well, you and I had nothing to do with that, unless you're a really old person watching this video who owned a coal burning factory in London. I highly doubt that's the case, right? So determining responsibility for those kinds of things and determining what kinds of cleanup procedures and mitigating procedures and things like that, those are going to be much harder to determine on a large scale event. So we'll talk more about that when we talk primarily about climate change and determining responsibility and those kinds of things. Okay, now, so the benefits of a property regime of private property is that it is unambiguous how we determine responsibility with respect to those small and medium scale events, right? So I bear primarily responsibility for cleanup, for the this is where I'm taking responsibility for the externalities. I'm not putting the burden on somebody else to deal with these kinds of problems. All right. Now, what about communal alternatives here? Aha. Now, one of the advantages of communal alternatives rather than private property regimes. If we talk about communal alternative regimes of property rather than private property, one of the major advantages of communal alternatives is that it dispenses the responsibility for the land to multiple individuals rather than just one individual in particular. So with private property, I and my family and then whoever I hire on as a worker, we are primarily responsible for its upkeep. Now, but with a communal piece of land, what it does is it diffuses environmental risk among every member. Okay, so even though there is a free rider problem here with, well, since responsibility is diffused among the various members of the commune or the community, some people might be able to afford to slack off. But again, depending on how close-knit the community is, slacking off might get you ostracized from the community. Because once again, even communes, even close-knit communities do have a right to exclude, or right to exclude. We'll kick you out of our community. We won't let you in our community. We'll build walls around our community, things like that. Okay. Now, so where communal alternatives to private property come into place and are actually preferable to private property regimes is when environmental risk is high and there aren't alternative programs available for dealing with that risk. So David Schmitz talks about insurance. So private property makes sense and private responsibility makes sense when we have certain kinds of protocols in place where you will be made whole in the event that I am negligent. That's why we have insurance. Now, but in order to have those kinds of programs in place, you already need to have a well-established society. So it seems that there's a natural progression here between original appropriation. Once we start building a community, we move from original appropriation of private property to kind of communal ownership. And then once we get larger as a society and we run the risk of depleting the resources and depleting the land, that is when we might move back into a private property regime where we make individuals responsible for individual parcels of land and then they directly reap the benefits. Now, obviously, in a private property regime as well, if I own the land, I own its resources, I am then free to do with whatever those resources I want. So if I want to sell my land, or I want to trade, the products of my labor, whether it be crops or cattle. I'm free to profit from that. I'm free to trade land. I'm free to trade whatever my land produces for whatever I want, so on and so forth. So even if individually we're all given the same. So we distribute land and its resources equally. So I get 3 acres, you get 3 acres, this other person gets 3 acres. If I have no interest in being responsible for 3 acres of land, I might sell off 2 of those acres. Or if I don't particularly want to be a landowner in the first place, or I like your land, your land would be better suited for what I want to do with my land, and vice versa, then we can negotiate and there can be a trade-off. Okay. Now, and it's through engaging in those kinds of free sort of market activities where we are, so this would be an example of what's called mercantile capitalism, where we're not setting prices monetarily for goods and services, we're bartering with each other, right? So if there's a natural progression between original appropriation when we're first settling frontier and homestead, then to communal ownership of land, and then as the community gets larger, to avoid depleting the resources, we move to a private property regime. This seems to be a natural progression here. Now, and obviously it might even be the case that after a time of having a private property regime, we might move back into some sort of communal ownership. So maybe as individuals on our individual plots of land with our own resources, maybe some of us want to come together and form a different kind of close-knit community, which is still geographically within the same region as the community at large, but we are going to sort of have our own place. So if you think of the Amish community, or you think of I don't remember the name of it, but the community in northern Canada that David Schmitz talks about, various communities in South America, in Peru in particular, where this has actually happened, that's all well and good. So environmentally speaking, though, both private property regimes and communal alternatives or green alternatives to private property regimes do have their benefits, but they also have their risks as well. All right. Okay, so a lot of these topics are going to come up again when we talk about climate change and carbon emissions and things like that. But for now, we'll just leave it there.